thing, as we'll see when we go over Gebser and look at the birth of perspective in painting, is this vast new discovery of infinite space. Northern European man was the first to step out of the closed womb of the universe and to sort of grow up, go out on his own and voyage into the unknown, and finally really just take the plunge into the unknown. So the next great sort of revolution here is the Copernican revolution. Copernicus published his text in 1543 on his deathbed, although he did write a sort of Cliff's Notes version of it in 1510 and circulated it privately amongst his friends. And so his word got round, his reputation got round that he had this amazing new sort of cosmology which was sun-centered, and the church was very interested in this. Now, Copernicus is not, we tend to think of Copernicus as this sort of almost the way we tend to portray Columbus as this hero, but in fact Copernicus was nothing but a hero. He was a very cowardly man who was afraid of publishing his book because he was afraid that the academics, not the church, but the academics would laugh at him. All of his friends were church people. He himself was a canon in the church. And the Protestant outbreak had started in 1517, but it hadn't really set things in the situation for Galileo. A century later, in 1600, is a whole different story. But now Copernicus was born in 1473 in Poland, and so he sort of got this idea from Aristarchus of Samos, as we mentioned earlier in the beginning, that what he wanted to do, and the reason why we can't really regard him as this revolutionary, is that he wanted to go back in time rather than forward in time. What he wanted to do was to restore the perfect circular motion to the planets that the ancients had insisted the planets must move in perfect circles. Plato in particular had insisted on this. And Copernicus himself was a geometrician. He was not an astronomer. He did not study the heavens. He may have glanced at it once or twice, but he was really a mathematician, and he was really a Platonist. And he was more a man of the Renaissance than of the scientific revolution which came after him, because the age of the Renaissance, remember, was the age of the discovery of the texts of Plato. So the sort of vogue in Aristotle had then shifted over to Plato, and he really wanted to restore everything back to this Platonic world. And the thinking in the Renaissance was not progressive. It wasn't that, as it was to be in the 17th century, that we have this new stuff and we can move forward and improve on everything. The idea was still a paradigm of decline. You could not improve on the ancients. You could not improve on Plato and Aristotle. The ancients had it all worked out. All you could do was use them as models and hope to equal them at best. So he wasn't trying to surpass the ancients. He was trying to carry us back into the Middle Ages, not forward out of it. So the whole thing kind of arises out of this strange little error in his thinking with respect, putting it this way. So what happens is he writes this little text, circulates it amongst his friends in the church. The secretary of Pope Leo X gives a little lecture in the Vatican on this new Copernican cosmology. Everyone in the church loves it. Why do they love it? Because in the 16th century, rather, this is the period of the reforming of the calendar. The church has trying to get the date for Easter fixed and get it right. And what they want is it has to come out as the first, Easter has to come out as the first Sunday after the first full moon after the equinox. Well, the date for the equinox is wrong. Why is the date for the... In 1582, the date for what should be March 21st was March 11th. How did this happen? So they start looking at all these calendars, and they realize, well, what happened was we inherited this calendar from the Egyptians, the first who came up with the first solar calendar in the world. All the other calendars of the world are lunar-based calendars. That's an important fact. It'll become important with respect to the evolution of consciousness, because Gene Gebser will say that's a direction in the motion of waking up, of evolving consciousness. And so he says, so the church is working this out, and what happens is that Julius Caesar brought this calendar over, and the estimation for the length of the year was 365¼ days. Well, in actual fact, it is 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, and 46 seconds, which is just shy of the 6 hours that would make it a quarter of a... So that throws everything off. And that 11-minute discrepancy in the length of the year starts pushing, the calendar starts floating backward, and they wind up with the equinox on March 11th. So they were interested in Copernicus because they thought that a sun-centered cosmology might solve this calendar problem. And in fact it didn't, but they were very interested in it for that reason. And what then happened was, one other point to be mentioned before we go any further is also with respect to this heliocentric cosmology. The Corpus Hermeticum, remember, had been discovered. It was brought over by these Greek monks at the end of the 15th century. And in the Corpus Hermeticum comes from Alexandria, and Alexandria was in Egypt, and the Egyptian cosmogony, remember, was all the planets spin around the sun in turn spins around the Earth. So it was kind of duocentric in that sense, although the Earth was the only thing stationary. Within the Corpus Hermeticum, though, you get this sun worship. You know, the Egyptians come up with the first solar calendar. Within the Corpus Hermeticum, they're singing praises to the sun, and there are even passages in there that suggest that there may have been a kind of sun-centered cosmology also within, in addition to this one that was revived by Tycho Brahe within the church. So that sort of created a climate within which the idea of a sun-centered cosmos was not really a bad idea. And if the ancients, in this case the Egyptians, had a precedent for it, well, why not? So the church took this very seriously. They wanted him to publish his work, and he was afraid of what he calls the clamor of the Boeotians, you know, the academics who were still entrenched, as academics always are. They're always stuck in the past, and they remain stuck in the past. And it takes the people who are out on the hinterlands and the fringes to change things. The change never comes from the center. It always comes from the periphery, those who are marginalized. And but he goes this sort of Protestant. Now the Protestants were particularly they did not like this idea at all of the Copernican, because they were getting rid of the rituals of the church, and they wanted to go back to the text. And Martin Luther's idea was sort of this idea that reality is a text, and you can have knowledge of this text by disseminating the Bible through the printing press to everyone. And we have to stick with what it says in the text. And when it says that Joshua stopped the sun because the sun was revolving around the earth, we've got to stick with that literalism. So the Protestants really, particularly, ironically, contrary to popular belief, the Protestants were the ones who were absolutely upset about this cosmology, not the church. So then, what then happens is that Copernicus dies, but before that had happened, he had met this young Protestant scholar named Rudolf, and Rudolf had come in and was totally fascinated by this new cosmology, and he did all this grunt work for Copernicus, tabulated all of these tables, and Copernicus was very ungrateful to him, and never mentioned him, and never gave him any acknowledgments in his book. But we have him to thank for a lot of this dissemination of these ideas, because Rudolf, of course, received the text from the deathbed and carried it on. And then, now it took a while for the Copernican vision to sink in. By the time you get to Shakespeare in 1600, it's there, it's in. As far as Shakespeare is concerned, everything is revolving around the sun. So you get this problem, you begin to get the early problems now about this sort of universe falling apart. You get this vision in King Lear of the entire Middle Ages just collapsing, and Lear's madness is sort of the sickness of the world, and there are all these storms and plagues that mirroring Lear's madness, and the whole medieval edifice is sort of crumbling. And then you get Hamlet sort of lost in his own cavern world ego. You know, what is man if he's bounded in a nutshell? All of this stuff. And then you get, we begin to get into the shift into our sort of next revolution as we move from the Copernican revolution to the Newtonian with Kepler and Galileo. Now Kepler is really my favorite figure in all of this. He's the most interesting character. Kepler was a man who had his foot in both worlds. He was an astrologer, and he was also an astronomer, and unlike Copernicus, whose data was based on no observations whatsoever, Kepler was keen on watching the skies. And he was a very bright young man, and he was invited by Tycho Brahe, who was 60. Tycho Brahe was this absurdly rich Danish astronomer who had had a castle built for him, a gigantic observatory called the Uraniborg that was built on the island of Wien off the coast of Denmark, where they studied the stars, naked eye observations still because there aren't any telescopes yet, but they're using things like sextants and astrolabes and quadrants and things. And Tycho Brahe was an absolutely tireless gatherer of data, just absolutely tireless. Obviously he had all this time on his hands, he was rich, he didn't have to work, and so they're pulling in all this data, and Tycho Brahe was the first to observe an interesting stellar event, a nova. In 1572, he witnesses what he thinks is the birth of a star. Now, a nova, as you all know, is the death of a star. A star goes supernova when it's dying, and it explodes and seeds space with all these chemical elements. But the thing that was interesting to him was, in this ancient cosmology, the heavens operate on a totally different set of laws than the earth. The heavens are the realm of eternity. They are the realm of perfection. Everything is perfect. You know, the desire of Copernicus to get those perfect circular spheres back.